840 here. I'm back with my regular guest, philosopher Rony Guldmann. He's also an attorney and an author. His website's RonyGuldmann.com. He wrote the memoir, The Star Chamber of Stanford. He's also working on a book in progress, Conservative Claims of Cultural Oppression on the Nature and Origins of Conservaphobia. And Rony, I understand it, you're at the beginning stages of an essay on heritage Americans. So please tell me more.
Okay, sure. This is sort of part of an ongoing project. I think I've met. I'm trying to translate some of the basic ideas of conservative claims of cultural oppression into a format that's more suitable to people who don't want to read 270,000 words or thereabouts. And I see heritage Americanism is certainly one way in which to do it. And so my question is: this an authentic concept? Is it just a coded racism or something else? That's sort of the inquiry, I don't have a favorable attitude towards it. I'm not gonna say that it's in every case just a pretext for racism. I can't say that in every case, but it's not a concept that makes a lot of sense to me. It's sort of, built into. There are different variants of heritage Americanism because you have different conceptions of what the heritage in question is. So, for example, if you were to go to someone like Rich Lowry, editor of the National Review, so that's a stream of conservatism which was kind of very anti-Trump at the outset, never Trumpers, but eventually they made their peace with Trump. I assume they wanted to stay relevant. So that's sort of one example. And there, the heritage in question, it's fairly broad. It's Western civilization. So, for example, Lowry, when the whole issue of all the Somali American fraud in Minnesota came out, and so he put out a video on that, and he's saying, well, of course, I don't approve of Trump calling an entire community garbage, but the real issue is this truth about culture, that people retain the culture of their ancestors to a significant degree. And why do you have so much crime among Southern Italians? It's because the conditions of Southern Italy, which were sort of a more barbaric backwaters, which wasn't as influenced by the Catholic Church and various medieval institutions. And so that's there. So there's Western civilization, and there are people who don't embrace our ideals of high trust, rules based order, and we have to be careful of that. Somalis being another example. So that's kind of a fairly broad view of heritage Americanism. You have a narrower one, which would be one advanced by which is Northwest European. So it's not even about Western civilization. It's not even about being white in the broad sense. It's having descended from the Protestant stock of the British Isles. And that I think was particularly weird for a number of reasons. I would imagine that in the U.S. today, most people, even people who are unambiguously white, are some combination of English and any number of other things. I think most people don't even know. They certainly can't guess, from talking to somebody or listening to their beliefs or looking at their demeanor. I don't think they could guess very well, what percentage of their ancestry is from, the Mayflower era, as opposed to, Polish or Czechian arrivals at Ellis Island. So it's not a concept that you could, readily apply. So preliminarily, that's my first reason as to why it doesn't make sense to me. And I can go on to provide you with others, unless you'd like to
Yeah, let's
interject or ask
interrogate
a
that.
question.
Yeah, let's interrogate that. So,
Okay.
from from a non-Jewish perspective, the Jewish claim to be God's chosen people doesn't make any sense. It just honestly, it just seems racist. So, whether the claim of heritage Americans makes sense or is authentic or is something you're comfortable with, whatever, entirely depends upon your own subjective hero system. There's no objective way to judge the authenticity of heritage American.
I guess. I mean, on one level, it's not, but I can say what I just said right now pretty confidently that I don't think that it's a very practical concept. What percentage of Americans know the extent the percentage of their genetic heritage that came from colonial America or pre-Civil War America or northwestern Europe as opposed to any number of other places, including white places. How would you even apply that? So I don't think that point is perspectival, and I think Donald Trump is not a heritage American. His mother is from Scotland, and that's the British Isles, but they did not arrive during the sort of the founding, the sort of the frontier experience, which proponents of heritage Americans, the heritage Americanism, think that's sort of the mystical founding period, the period during which America became America. So he's not a heritage American on that side, and his dad, his grandfather came from Germany, so again you could say Germanic, but not British, not from the founding period. But I don't think anybody who uh nobody thinks that he's less of an American than anybody else because of that. So people who say, well, it's all about, did you have ancestors during the founding period? Again, I mean, I don't. Maybe they can articulate their feelings in a way which would be, I could find plausible. People have different rationales, so I'm not, But from what I read, from what are the sort of the dominant interpretations, it's not something which jives with the ordinary experience of most people, including people who can claim that background. Now you have, for example, you have in America certain groups, certain subcultures that fight to resist modernity in order to maintain certain ancestral folkways. Certainly, maybe the Amish are the most extreme, where they forego modern technology. That's the way of Dutch settlers in the 17th and 18th century. You have the Hasids, the various Hasidic branches, and we're going to retain the ancestral folkways of Eastern European Jews in the 17th or 18th century, and to that end they just resist certain features of modern life and cling to certain ways that are just downright foreign to mainstream Americans. But we don't have that among heritage Americans. For example, you don't have them saying, well, I don't eat pizza, I don't listen to rock and roll, because these are not of Anglo Protestant vintage, or they're not going to I was just watching on Netflix Turn. It's a pretty good like spy drama in revolutionary America. It's all about the George Washington's espionage rings, and you can see that they had like Philadelphia or Boston high society. They had like certain mores of what it is to be a proper gentleman or a proper lady. I don't think anyone in the US, even conservatives who might defend some conception of traditional gender roles or whatnot, nobody's trying to preserve those ways in the way that you see, Hasids or, the Amish or maybe certain other groups, making genuine sacrifices to say, I'm going to pay the price of dissociating myself from the modern world in order to preserve these ancestral folkways. You don't have actual heritage Americans doing that. So again, I can't question anybody's feelings, but for it to be, but how's it going to make sense to me? Well, we can't. Most people don't know whether they're heritage Americans. It's not a clearly identifiable anti-modernist insular group like the Hasids or the Amish or whoever. So, if they want me to accept that category, they can believe what they want. But if I'm to accept that category, they've got to articulate it in a way that is coherent to me. And I'm not sure that I've seen that so far.
Right. Well, number one, they don't give a fuck what you think and whether it's articulate to you because you're outside of the category. Number two, you're making a category error. Identity claims do not depend on some ontological global version of truth. They work as a signaling device to other members of a coalition. So when you talk about heritage Americans, this is not primarily a truth claim like other forms of political and cultural rhetoric. This is primarily a coalition claim, and you have to use coded language in today's world.
So the question? So what is being signaled then?
Right.
In
So
that case,
it's a signal, and it's a signal of to people who feel closer to the core. So American politics can be divided into the white Christian core of the country and the coalition of the fringe. You're Jewish, I'm Jewish. We belong in the coalition of the fringe, as do gays and blacks and Asian Americans, Mexican Americans. These are groups that overwhelmingly vote with the party of the coalition of the fringe, the Democratic Party. The Christian white core of the country is what people may refer to as the heritage Americans or Christian Americans. Whether it's Christian nationalist or heritage Americans, it's all signaling the same sort of identity coalition, which you can simply identify being as hostile to the coalition of the fringe.
So, but here's my question: Why? Let's say I'll accept broadly that there's a certain antagonism, and obviously any dualism is going to oversimplify. But let's say that as oversimplifications go, it's not a wild oversimplification. You have these two groups or ideologies or sensibilities or whatever you want to call them. Why would you call one of them the core and one of them the fringe when in fact when you look at electoral politics, it's pretty 50 with some variation. What
Okay, the
is there
reason is that
anything?
historically the white Christian core has been approximately 90% of the country until the last 50 years.
Okay, that's true, but I think sort of here's an alternative narrative to that, which is they say like the heritage American thesis says that we formerly had a great deal of moral, cultural, and religious unity until that was broken up by various outsiders. But again, what is the core? So for sure, after 1965, you had a lot more non-white immigration coming in, but a huge amount of that were Christians from Latin America, and a lot of Chinese and Korean immigrants. They're Christian as well. So I mean, are they and some of them are Protestant evangelical Christians. Maybe, most Hispanics are Catholics, but not as much anymore. Are they part of the core because they're Christians, or still not?
Generally, no, but as you understand, all political cultural arrangements are historically contingent. So, generally speaking, no, but in a certain contingent arrangement, in a certain situation, they could be folded into the core if, say, for some reason, some sort of a Christian identity becomes salient to the understanding of Heritage American. There's not a set Christian, Jewish, or Heritage American identity, it's always contingent.
But I guess, but if you're a Heritage American, I mean, if your core identity was purely religious or denominational, then I don't know why. If that was what was most important, I guess a pure Christian nationalist, they shouldn't care so much about other aspects of people's identities other than religion, if that was the core thing. But if that's not going to be the only thing, I guess, what's the formula for assessing their relative affinity to Heritage Americanism? Uh, they're Christian in certain ways. Verse but they come from a culture which is quite different elsewhere. Whereas, let's say, me, even though not Christian, if you look at ethnic origins, you would certainly find some Middle Eastern there. Even though I was born in France to a French university professor, and so culturally I wouldn't be as removed from the U.S. as some of these people. I mean, maybe you might dismiss it as kind of a Socratic trick. You're asking people to articulate definitions, whereas then any definition is going to be an imperfect reflection of real life attitudes. I accept that, but still, I can ask that question, and if you just say, well, if it's just Christianity, if it's just I have a certain belief in the Bible, and that's the most important thing, and that's the truth, and the most important thing is whether you adhere to it or not. That I might disagree with, but at least I understand that it's a perfectly clear way of framing your identity. Heritage Americanism, as I was saying before, seems marked by all of these problems, which Christian nationalism as such, I understand what it is, at least. I can't
Right.
say the
So,
same about Heritage Americanism.
right, because and it shows through all of your work, if I may say so, you're
Sure.
under theorized with regard to the tacit. So the tacit refers to that which can't be properly fully
Right.
articulated into words. So if you look at your memoir, it's a complaint made with great philosophical sophistication that you experienced an opposition that was not philosophically coherent or impressive. Nobody explicitly told you with words that your research agenda was ideologically impermissible. Nobody said to you with words that a book or a paper on conservative cultural claims of oppression that was not ironic was unacceptable. Instead, you had a whole series of conversations in which the content of your work was not directly engaged, where the
Right.
objections to your work were never explicit, they were always tacit. And so what's going on is that the opposition that you experienced throughout your memoir was tacit. And so too, these formations, whether it's Heritage American or to be part of God's chosen people, or whatever the identity is that doesn't make ontological truth to you, or that doesn't seem coherent when you put it into words, that's not how the world operates. The world operates on the basis primarily of tacit relations, tacit formations that can't be properly or fully articulated. And so your whole memoir was about a tacit opposition to you that would never become
Mhm.
legible. It could not afford to be legible. It was an opposition that was tacit. And so too, the formation of an identity that you don't find impressive and that you don't accept as authentic. It's a tacit identity. And in one situation, it may express itself as Christian. In another situation, it may express itself as ethnic. Another situation, it may express itself as racial. In another expression, it may primarily express itself as opposition to censorship. The tacit formation can take many different names, and it can be given many different words, and it can have a racial or a religious or a cultural or a political expression in this or that situation. But what it fundamentally is a tacit understanding of who is we and who is the opposition.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. Yeah. Fair enough. I think that's a a fair characterization of of what I was saying. And I guess, and you can have, any articulation is going to have, various, contradictions and logical infirmities. And, you can say that therefore, that can't be a refutation, because by that standard, we all stand refuted on some level. And, fair enough. But I think that there's still differences in degree, in differences um in the extent to which the imperfect articulation can conveys the unarticulated ethos. And when someone says they're a Christian nationalist, I I kind of, again, there I it 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 makes sense. I mean, to the extent that they say, well, the the founding, they say we're originally a Christian nation. Well, I don't think that's true in terms of the founding documents as well. No reference to that into Christianity in the Declaration of Independence, and I could go on, but I still understand that, yeah, they are still alluding to an earlier time, when moral values were more taken for granted. The kind of person you were supposed to be was more taken for granted. And certainly those values, even though they varied, obviously had something to do with Christianity, given the people who came to make up the U.S. So um, that that, at least, even though it's contradicted by the facts at some level, I understand the impulse. There's like sort of an underlying impulse. So when we get to heritage Americanism, we would say, well, what is the underlying impulse, as opposed to the flawed or distorted, imperfect or misleading, articulation. I think, for that, I think the probably the best explanation of that is, it was Senator Schmidt, I think he's a Missouri senator. He gave a speech to the National Conservatism Conference 1 or 2 years ago, and so he had he wasn't he his ancestors didn't arrive during the colonial period, but they were German Germans who arrived in Missouri, and Missouri is sort of the gateway to the West. And so for him, he associates the heritage, even though it's in some regard it's with Western civilization writ large, like Rich Lowry, but it's also the pioneer slash frontier spirit, fighting off the Indians, the wagon trains, all the travails of a frontier life. So he's kind of, that's the association for him. And so, yeah, as is consistent with what I wrote in the book, yeah, there's a certain type of embodied toughness which conservatives, the poorest self, right, which conservatives will identify with, which is sort of an anathema to the more disembodied uh, universal consciousness of modernity. And yeah, that is sort of, I guess, it's a way of the frontier virtues of the cowboy. It's a way of alluding to that, but it's also a way which is again, I just don't know that it can resonate with many people, but except for those who are ideologically committed to it. Again, because I think most people are an admixture of founding era, British Anglo Protestants and various
Right, right.
other
You made
people.
that point. So you can't respect any identity that's not ontologically sound to you, but that's not how identity is formed. Identity is something that is tacit, and you can't respect it if it's not philosophically principled.
Well, I mean, the real problem, I mean, really, the internal logical consistency, I mean, it's sort of a second. Let me put it this way: when somebody, you have people who remember their Irish American heritage, for example, okay, and they're big on St. Patty's days, or their Catholicism, or they love Notre Dame or football, or whatever it is, you know do I understand the sentiment fully? Can I enter it? Maybe I don't, but I don't have a problem with it either, because you know I mean, in the end, those people, or even Hispanics and Cinco de Mayo or whatever, yeah, they're making a claim. They're demanding recognition for a certain kind of distinctiveness, for having had certain distinctive experiences, which not everyone has had, and they're making a claim for, I guess, the value of those experiences, and uh, which those experiences impart upon the melting pot. Whether that's true or not is another issue, but that's the only claim they're making. I mean, but I think that when heritage Americans, it's not just people who, oh, I happen to know that I had ancestors on the Mayflower or whatever, and I think that's pretty cool, and I'm proud of that. It's not just that. I mean, they want a kind of recognition of their superiority vis-a-vis other groups. And so something which you said at the outset, um which is that well, you're a late coming Jew, what they don't care what you think of them. Well, I mean, yeah, they don't care about me in particular, but I mean, they care about their broad standing in American society. They are demanding a certain form of recognition, which is fine in itself. But what they want is they are asking for a recognition of their superiority. They're saying, by virtue of having had ancestors who came from a propitious, cultural background, namely, the successful British Empire, in all sorts of ways, and having had these like formative experiences on the American frontier, which sort of toughened them up in all sorts of ways, made them stronger people, that therefore they have been bequeathed with certain virtues, which impart upon them um, a certain kind of superiority, which is not being properly recognized by everyone else, and whose non-recognition is distorting American policies. That I mean, so I think they are making that kind of a claim. And so for example, Vivek Ramaswamy, he was at the I think it was the national some conservative conference, national prestigious conference, and he went out against heritage Americanism, and a lot of people dislike him, I think, not just because of that, because earlier here I said, well, the problem with Americans is that you're imparted with the wrong values in high school. You become a jock, you don't work hard, you don't study, and then you become a loser. But it's us Indian immigrants who are kind of nerdy but end up thriving in the end. And he was widely resented, I think, by self-professed heritage Americans, because the implicit and sometimes explicit thesis of heritage Americanism is that you have a certain groups of people who, by virtue of having ancestors who came from certain backgrounds and had certain formative experiences on the American continents, are sort of made superior and more competent to guide the direction of the country. And then you have somebody like Vivek Ramaswamy who's telling them, well, I mean, actually it's us South Asian immigrants who are the ones who are truly thriving. And to the extent that you see, modern entrepreneurialism as sort of the modern analog or expression of these, 18th and 19th century frontier virtues, it's actually, yeah, these South Asian Hindus who are the ones who are manifesting them, the most. Not JD Vance's, economically stagnant Appalachian stock. So we can have our subjective experiences, but I think that there are, within the heritage American identity, there are sort of these implicit factual claims about their, superiority in terms of their ability to organize, rational social relations and advance science and technology. And someone like Vivek Ramaswamy is a reminder that, whatever importance Protestantism and that heritage may have had in certain periods of history in fostering the advance of science and technology and industry, and I'm sure it did, certainly, but that to sort of, fetishize that and say that that should inform our self-understanding. Again, you take the identity, you take these again, yeah, I admit these
Wait,
are
wait, you
things.
don't have to repeat. You keep going back to, unless they're ontologically sound, you can't take an identity seriously, which is simply doesn't make any evolutionary sense. It works in a philosophical game, but in the real world, in the evolutionary forces that have shaped us for millions of years, tribal identity has never depended upon philosophical consistency. It's never depended on being able to articulate this or that. It has solely been about signaling to your tribe that you know who is in your tribe and who the enemy is. And it didn't require anything that was spoken. It could just entirely be tacit. And the main opposition to your two major books, your memoir and Conservative Claims of Opposition, is a tacit arrangement of hierarchies that was lined up and had no interest in being philosophically legible. That was what you're up against at Stanford. That's the opposition that was creating the conservative claims of oppression, and it doesn't require any philosophy, doesn't require any words. It's a tacit arrangement of social relations that is in opposition to one group and is a tribe. You've got two warring tribes, and they can use different language, but in the final analysis, it comes down to tacit social relations.
Uh, okay. I mean, I'm not saying that I understand the the evolutionary sources of the appeal of heritage Americanism. I'm not saying it's an unprecedented phenomena. I'm not saying that it's the product of a broken brain. I agree that if you look at the underlying impulses, yeah, they originate in human nature, and even and again, consistent with the book, even people who deny those appeals have their own, subterranean, hidden variations of them. That's true, but at the end of the day, um, not everybody has that set of subjective resonances, and they come out to the wider society, they make certain claims on the wider society. So when JD Vance I think he said, New York's new mayor, before he was the mayor, he should shut up, because he's of South Asian extraction. His family moved to Uganda, I think, and eventually to the U.S. And on the 4th of July, Jawan Mamdani said, well, we have a very, we should, something to the effect of, well, we should, remember, our ideals are not yet fulfilled. There's a heavy emphasis on, yeah, we have these great American ideals, but there's a heavy emphasis on, we have as yet failed to realize them. He had this critique. Um, and JD Vance's responses was, he just arrived in the country. Who the hell is he to, to make these criticisms of America? Um, I mean, because he's not a heritage American, because he only recently just arrived. If you don't subjectively identify as a heritage American, you can say to me, on the one hand, you have to realize that yeah, they have these subjective psychological appeals, which is true, which I acknowledge in the book. But on the other hand, these people also come out to the wider society, to people who don't have those same subjective experiences, and they do demand, implicitly or explicitly, some form of recognition. And when they do that, I mean, what is one to say? You have to say that, ultimately you're making claims that don't cohere logically. And so how do you expect anybody outside your group to extend you any sympathy in the face of these inconsistencies and contradictions?
Well, they don't expect any sympathy. They are simply, when people talk politics and argue politics, they're simply trying to build up their own side and demean, put down, and intimidate the other side. So that's all this fancy rhetoric boils down to. J.D. Vance had a reaction that makes evolutionary sense. Zoran Mandani, if he said what you said, that America was failing to live up to its ideals, that is a story that makes zero evolutionary sense. It only makes sense as a status play. If you successfully make a status play and get resources and become elected mayor of New York, then that is a play that works, but it's not about what you say it is. It's a status play because your claim makes no evolutionary sense. No tribe has ever put itself down for failing to live up to its ideals.
Um. Well, I mean, no tribe has. I mean, certainly, if you look at most of human history, I think that's true. But here's I guess here's the problem. If heritage Americans simply asserted themselves as, another human tribe, um that is entitled to human nature's default instincts, then maybe from a certain perspective you couldn't criticize them. But
Well,
you
no tribe
do
has ever done
have.
that in all of human history, right?
What's that?
No tribe has done that in all of human history. All tribes have done is use signals that we're the best and the enemy sucks.
That is normal. But you do have, starting in the 17th and 18th century in Europe, it's not we suck, but there are, ever growing questions about, do we just have, is the way we do things just this random product of habit and contingency, and not a reflection of, the order of things or our superiority. I mean, that phenomenon obviously exists, because otherwise conservatives wouldn't have a grievance if it didn't exist. And their own grievance acknowledges that it exists. So I don't think it's as unnatural as all that. It's certainly nothing that would have
Well, that movement you're
occurred since
referring
the
to
Stone
is
Age, but it's not antithetical to human nature, because it arises from human nature. It did, for good or ill. It did.
yeah, it did among 0.1% of the population making a status play. It didn't for 99% of the population.
Well, I mean, most of the changes in human history were initiated by the 1% of something. Like that's not unusual for changes to be spearheaded by a small but influential, minority. If we're talking about things that are like human universals, as you say, tribalism is, well, so is elite change as well, I think.
Well, campaigning or articulating human universals makes zero evolutionary sense except as a status play. So if you can get more resources by making this particular case, then it works. Other than that, it makes zero evolutionary sense because we did not evolve to prioritize abstract philosophical globalized truths. We evolved to prioritize that which works for us and the immediate members of our family and extended family.
Well, I mean, we didn't evolve, to do all sorts of things. I mean, I don't think that there's been much evolutionary change among human beings of any race or ethnicity for tens of thousands of years. But yet in that time, you've had, all all sorts of changes in ideas and ways of being. So I mean, I look, it's not that I'm not hostile to, evolutionary psychology and the application of I definitely think we always have to ask, how do we view our modern societies in light of all of these, uh, evolutionary mechanisms? That's certainly an interesting question, but I don't think you can use, what was normal during most of our evolution as a normative barometer, because there's just so many things that fall outside of that, even non-ideological things, so many things we embrace that don't bear a clear connection to our
So what
evolution.
are things that we embrace that are in opposition to evolutionary sense?
Look, I agree that at a certain level, and this is affirmed in the book, that I agree that there's a certain level in which we don't escape our evolutionary origins at all. In that, when you attack wokeness and political correctness, as it's been called, differently over the decades, certainly you can find that even among, people who tout universalist, values, there's a certain form of status climbing and, in group affirmation, and that's what, certainly the book is an admonishment to liberals to be more self-aware as to those possibilities. Um, but nonetheless, they're that, but they're not just that. I mean, they do, in the long run, influence, how we think of ourselves, and I don't think that in reality, we could I can't imagine a society where, let's say, technology and DNA tests had actually could give us contemporaneous knowledge of everybody's genetic lineage and the extent to which their ancestors, participated in America's formative experiences. Even if we, had that knowledge, right in front of our eyes, each time we met new people, I don't think it's something that we could constitutionally really act on. I think there'll be so many other factors in our experiences that would just in real life would impress us more strongly than the extent to which they were, of Anglo-Protestant, stock whose ancestors arrived to the U.S. before 1865 or whatever. That's just not. It's not something which even though it resonates subjectively on some level, of course, otherwise nobody would be propounding the thesis. But I think in on a day-to-day level, in real life, I don't think it can. And I'm not saying that's the case for all right-wing constructs. As you said at the outset,
Right. You can't
they're
accord
all
any
imperfect.
respect. You can't accord any respect to an identity that threatens and endangers your identity.
Do I respect it? I
No, you
mean,
can't. This is an identity that threatens your identity. So how could you be expected to be at peace with it?
um, well, I think to the extent it threatens my identity, I don't think it's because I have a more universalist identity. I don't think it's because I have a more Jewish identity, for example.
Right,
That
but
that
you're
to me could
outside the circle of we in this identity. However you frame heritage American, you're outside it.
no, I'm certainly outside it. Well, I mean, um, I don't
And
know. I
because
mean,
you demean this identity, you will be treated as the enemy. So you're the enemy from the perspective of this identity. So you cannot be expected to be disinterested with regard to framing heritage American. This is like populism. So all the historians who are hyper anti-populism were pretty much Jews. They were descendants of people who'd survived the pogroms in Europe, and they had this instinctive fear of populism. While almost all the historians that were sympathetic to American populism were non-Jews, because they didn't have that particular formation. So a different tacit formation creates a very different reaction to things, whether it's heritage American or populist. You have a tacit formation that makes you inherently hostile to heritage American or to populism.
well, but to say that the sole explanation for that is the Jewish background, I mean, not I can't claim to be an expert on this, but I mean, I think you have all sorts of strands of 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 Christian American identities who do not identify with heritage Americans. Put it in terms of a Jewish versus Christian thing. I mean, again, they say, they might say, the idea propositional nationalism, the idea that Americanism is a creedal identity was inserted by Jews. I mean, Thomas
I did
Jefferson was not a Jew.
you boil it. No, you're
Lincoln,
boiling it
the
down to
Gettysburg
Jew.
Address.
I just said
You
you have
have
a tacit formation. You have a tacit formation. There may be a genetic component to that. There may be a cultural component to that. There may be many different components to that, Jewish, non-Jewish, education. But you have a tacit formation that cannot be disinterested with regard to either heritage American as an identity or populist as an identity. You instinctively, inherently must be in opposition to that due to your tacit formation. Before you even begin to think about these identities, you instinctively feel, prior to forming any words, a great deal of fear and danger from these identities.
Well, what I put it to you this way, that whatever instinctive I hostility I might have towards them is just as strong, at least as strong as my hostility towards the religious Zionists, in Hebron or other parts of the West Bank.
Yes, I agree.
It's
You
just
have
so
an instinctive tacit formation that makes you highly uncomfortable with nationalism of an intense variety of any type.
okay, but then it's not, if that's the case, then it's not really a Jewish versus
That's what I
non-Jewish
keep saying.
thing.
It's
It's
not.
not
It's
heritage
not.
versus
It's not.
non-heritage thing.
It's your formation makes you hostile to certain identities, and you cannot be expected to be disinterested or objective when it comes to identities that are a threat to yours and has nothing to do with Jewish or not Jewish.
Okay, yeah, I mean, on that level of generality, I mean, yeah, I mean, do I have, because I don't have, I mean, I understand what you're saying. I mean, so much of the book is built around the thesis that, look, you have, at the end of the day, people have these visceral instincts which attach them to their identities, which on some level are invaluable to their flourishing. Yeah, I'm not denying those general truths, and it's like one can make that point in a lot of different ways, and one can spend hundreds and hundreds of pages articulating the various um permutations of that truth, as I did in the book. But there's also the sphere of concrete political engagement. I've been trying to, you sent me the AI reviews of the book, and it's too long, and that's a problem. And but one of the reasons why it got that long is that I always felt like you know, I have to make allowances for these basic points that you're articulating right now, which is that at the end of the day, people are situated where they are, they have certain identities, and you have to understand that to understand anything. But to understand all is to forgive all, and you can go on and understanding the various previously neglected layers of people's experience. But when you engage people in actual political forums, and people make arguments, and they expect others to be persuaded, or they think others should be persuaded. I think, like, even most heritage Americans, like, if we're talking about visceral feelings, they feel that liberals should be persuaded by their arguments, and that to the extent they're not, that's by virtue of some sort of moral deficiency in them. So they themselves, that's why I disagree with something that you've said at several points about this discussion, which is that they just don't give a shit. I suspect that that's not entirely true, just because they're human, and so they make their appeals to a broader audience. And then, and at that point, that broader audience has a right to subject their arguments to various logical criteria.
Well, does it make any evolutionary sense that people evaluate arguments on the basis of logic, or do they evaluate them on the basis of what is best for their coalition slash tribe? When people make political arguments, they're not trying to make logical or philosophical or ontological sense. All they're trying to do is to signal to their coalition that their coalition is righteous and the enemy is scum. Now, you can do this with varying degrees of sophistication, but that's what political arguments always come down to. We should feel good on our side, and the enemy are evil.
I mean, I just don't. If I hear a speech from J.D. Vance or Senator Schmidt, and I see all these logical problems with them, should I then ask myself, okay, there are all these logical problems in their arguments, but does it make evolutionary sense that they should be saying anything different?
Yes, because they're not. You're evaluating what they say on the basis of ontological standards, but what they're saying are primarily coalition signals. They're not primarily making ontological arguments. So you're evaluating speech that is primarily transmitting coalition signals, and you're evaluating it on a standard that has absolutely nothing to do with what they're saying.
Is that wrong? If that
I
were the
don't know.
case,
I think you should just be explicit about it. I'm evaluating XYZ on the basis of standards that have absolutely nothing to do with how these signals are being sent or received.
okay. So I mean, well, I guess it's a way of saying, a lot of conservatives, they critique the left for equating speech with violence, in various speech codes. But I think what one interpretation of what you're saying is that at the end of the day, all speech is violence of a certain kind. When
Yeah,
they're
all political
speaking.
speech. Yeah, all political speech boils down to who controls the coercive apparatus of government, which is backed up by violence.
Well, but even the speech itself, it's ultimately an attempt to
It is.
disrupt people's paradigm, just to kind of thrust them violently into
Yeah.
a different way of seeing
Yes.
things
No, no,
at
no. You don't
some
try to.
level,
You
right?
try to demean them. You try to take them down. You try to injure them.
Right. You
You try
try
to
to
injure your enemies and strengthen your friends.
you raise the you attempt to raise the social standing of
Your
certain
coalition.
views and
Yes.
demean the social standing of other views, and you're saying that, well, that's disguised as a logical argument, as in, what you're saying doesn't make sense by virtue of XYZ contradiction, but really it's
Yes.
not about logical consistency, it's about status regulation.
Yeah, it's about
uh
coalition signals. You're saying something to your coalition. So when Trump says we've wiped out Iran, he is sending a coalition signal to his MAGA base. When Trump says we're about finished with the war, he's sending a different signal to Wall Street. When Trump sends another signal, he's talking to his armed forces. When Trump says something else, he's speaking to Iran. And so even though Trump is speaking to all these different coalitions, his speech is always analyzed by the news media on the basis of its truth, not on the basis of what he's doing, which is sending a signal to a particular coalition.
yeah, well, I agree. I mean, that's. I mean, we can. These aren't incompatible perspectives. I mean, I think we can sort of,
Yes, I agree.
acknowledge them both, and I think a lot of commentators, do acknowledge them both. That he's, you know, logically it makes no sense, but there is a certain, political savvy to it. No one would dispute Trump's political savvy. That much is clear. But I I guess, I mean, yeah, maybe we're all animals at heart, and we
Well,
have
we
these
are
sort of.
all animals at heart. Now, we
Yeah,
may be something in
we have
addition,
these
but
subterranean.
without doubt, we are all animals at heart. And at core, if a story doesn't make evolutionary sense, it isn't what it says it is.
um okay, well, I mean, I don't know. With that point, I guess I have some disagreement. I mean, it's one thing if you say, understand that humans are humans, humans are animals. You've got to keep that in in mind whenever you make any criticism, because if you don't keep that in mind, you don't really understand what's driving things. But now, I mean, I think you're saying something a little bit stronger. You're saying that sort of any criticism that doesn't just affirm the rightness of these visceral impulses, which doesn't encourage people just to accept them as just natural, that discourse is illegitimate.
No, it has nothing to do with right or wrong. It's just that if a story doesn't make evolutionary sense, then that has to be accounted for, and then profit an explanation that does make sense. So, for example, you and
Okay,
I spend much of our most valuable time doing things that don't explicitly make any evolutionary sense. We
fair
both
enough.
say and write things that make no evolutionary sense because we're making status plays. We're saying that we understand certain abstract issues uh, far more clearly than other people do. And if we're right, we will get status. And if we get status, we get resources. And then that makes evolutionary sense.
Well, but we also, well, okay, what we're doing, our activities would make evolutionary sense if the truth of our claims were eventually to accrue us some level of
Resources.
status,
Yes.
but it's not going to do that in all likelihood,
Well,
right?
maybe so far it hasn't, right? Except that it brings us pleasure. So we're playing a game, and it brings us great pleasure. Certainly, it brings me great pleasure to spend all my spare time doing what we're doing here, even though it
Yes, but does
doesn't.
that pleasure make evolutionary sense?
I think it does, but it's not because I care about what is right and true. It's because I am engaged in a pleasurable pursuit of status, which has not paid off, but I enjoy the attempt anyway.
Well, but you're aware of the obstacles impeding that pursuit of status.
Yes.
You're aware why you're aware of why it's highly unlikely in the world as it is, right? I mean, it's purely I mean, so I'm just saying, given that you're smart enough, I'm smart enough, we both understand that whatever our instincts about what deserves status, may be, it's just if we wanted status, there are far better ways of going about it.
Well, we want a particular form of status. We want the form of status for which there's about the lowest market reward, but it's the one we want most, and that is clarity with regard to ontology.
But we understand that you can't to demand your own form of status is counterproductive, because status by its very nature depends on the
Right. That's why the
recognition.
successful pursuit of status requires that you come off as though you're not doing this. Right. So the charismatic are those who are the most successful at the social paradox, where they accumulate status by pretending not to care about status. So, for example, in English departments, you can say, oh, I just care about the text. And unlike everyone else who's playing a status game, I just care about the experience of reading a text. And so this is about the highest and most effective form of status claim, because it is framed in a way that seems to have absolutely nothing to do with status. And so to be successful, you have to be able to pull off these social paradoxes. We're not successful because we're not pulling off these social paradoxes.
Right. So that's why I would say it doesn't make evolutionary sense. If we were both at, some sort of, some prestigious postmodern, English department, at Duke or somewhere, then then it would make evolutionary sense to do what we're doing. But we're not, and we both know we're not. So that's I I guess, I mean, this comes down to, like something makes no sense if it makes no evolutionary sense, and I'm whether what we're doing makes sense or it doesn't, uh, generally, it doesn't seem to make evolutionary sense, just because we're both conscious enough to realize that, even though, certain evolutionary things may be at play, we both understand that the world as it is, given where we are, you know, probabilistically, it's not likely to result in status. Therefore, if that was the goal, why are we doing this rather than, I don't know,
Okay, and I would
working
argue
on a
to
day
the
trade or
yeah,
something?
I would argue to you that we're doing this because even though we both appear low status, we're both getting enough rewards to keep going. So, for example, I get to exchange emails and phone calls with some of the leading philosophers in the world. I email them, they email me back, we talk, and it has tremendous reward to me. So I have real life connection to people who have real status and real resources. And you were a star at Stanford Law for a while. And even now, you must still be getting some sustenance. Must still be getting some reward, or you would not be able to continue doing what you're doing. And I think the counterexample proves the point. I have all sorts of friends who are smarter than I am, but they have ceased reading books. And why have they ceased reading books? They give all sorts of explanations, but it boils down to they have no one in their life with whom they can have satisfying conversations about the books they're reading. Ergo, they've lost that. Because I have people in my life who I can talk to about these things, I still get sustenance and bonding. I am building a tribe of people interested in these topics, and that gives me strength and energy and enough of a reward that I keep going. And you must be experiencing something of the same.
Okay, well, yeah, I agree, insofar as you're saying that we wouldn't do what we're doing. No one would do what they're doing if they didn't, like, get some kind of accompanying satisfaction. However idiosyncratic. I mean, that's fine. But if that's if that's all we're saying, then why do we need to bring in you know uh, evolution and evolutionary psychology into that? Like, because that
It's just one framework. It's limited. Just because a framework is limited is not 100% of the answer. You then add other frameworks. So another framework is hero system. You and I have a hero system that puts the most value on what we're doing now and the accompanying work. That is our particular hero system. That's what gives our deeds eternal significance to us. That's what is our form of an immortality project.
Yeah, indeed, and I mean, is heritage Americanism a
It's a hero
kind
system and immortality project.
immortality project?
Yes.
Yeah, a hero system. Um, I guess, but I get, what would y- w- we can grant that it's a hero system, but what if I mean, the Democratic critique of the Republican, promoted hero system is that, yeah, you're offering them a hero system in lieu of concrete, benefits. What if, in many parts of the South, what if wages were 30% higher and no one, had to worry about, health care at all, or paying for your kids' college? Would people be inclined towards the heritage American hero system to the extent they are now?
Well, obviously they do, because man does not live by bread alone. Man also lives by hero systems. And so a hero system that feeds you is more valuable than a hostile hero system that may provide additional material benefits.
Okay, but why? But why would, if you had these? I guess someone from the left would say, okay, but let's say you had these more, propitious, material conditions. People felt more secure. Then people would just go off and develop, their own more individuated hero system, just as you described with respect to you and
There's,
I, just
yeah,
just, just right now. And the reason they're not doing that is because of the conditions under which they live, which precludes those more individuated hero systems, and only permits what the Republicans offer, which is some variation of the heritage American hero system, or
right.
something
But
something
an
something similar.
individuated hero system does not work. You have to have other people who support your hero system, or your hero system simply falls apart. It cannot sustain itself on a solitary basis.
Right.
You have to have a community, even if it's an abstract community of people that you email with. So I'm part of the Orthodox Jewish hero system, which is a very concrete form of hero system. And then second, comfort and just feeling good and feeling pride is so much more valuable than many material advantages. So I feel comfortable and I feel pride, which is one of the most amazing feelings possible. And those advantages that go with a certain tacit formation and a certain form of tacit social arrangements is so much more important to me than many material advantages, as it is for everyone. You either feel comfortable with a certain tacit arrangement or you don't. And it's really hard to bribe someone to embrace a tacit social arrangement that is excruciating just because you get free healthcare.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Like, we agree on the more general level, and certainly, I would disagree with a certain leftist streak that is, yeah, is going to, completely dehumanize, the basket of the deplorables or the bitter clingers, and not realize that they're ultimately motivated by something, universal, in which, all of us partake at some level, which is, what a lot of the book is about. But to acknowledge that as sort of, at the most general level, it still kind of leaves open the question of, but which hero system is it going to be, in
But you
the
don't
end.
choose your hero system. You know this. Your hero system is chosen for you, and you have a predisposition due to tacit arrangements for a particular hero system. You don't just choose among variations, usually. You take on a particular hero system, usually, that is transmitted to you tacitly.
Right. Well, yeah. Yeah. I don't want to moralize this and say like people have to choose their own hero system, but in doing what we're doing, every podcaster doing what they're doing, they're all attempting to influence the background cultural fabric that makes certain the adoption of certain hero systems more or less likely. So,
Yes,
yeah, from the
yes,
individual perspective, it's not even a
yes.
choice. Yeah, it's just
Yes,
something
yes.
you
It's
go
and
into
there's a
and
great biological term for that, and that is niche construction. Every single form of life, every organism tries to construct the niche around it so that it's most favorable for itself and for its
right.
relations. So niche construction is powerful. Okay, let's switch to your memoir, The Sad Chamber of Stanford, and let me just run a few sentences by you that
Okay,
I
go
was
ahead.
just writing today.
Sure.
Goldman's central complaint in his memoir, said across hundreds of pages with considerable philosophical sophistication, is that the enforcement he experienced at Stanford Law School operated entirely through channels that could not be formally contested. Is that fair?
Um, yeah, I mean, technically they could be formally contested, but not
Not practically.
plausibly.
Yeah,
You know, there's no way I could say, well, the reason it's taking me so long to give you anything, readable is because I have this powerful intuition that needs to be articulated. I mean, I would look ridiculous. Technically, I could say it, but not with any social plausibility.
exactly. So it was the tacit arrangements that what made your experience so excruciating. So let me read another sentence. Nobody told him his research agenda was ideologically impermissible.
Um, yeah, that's true. I mean, again, a lot of people when they read the book, they read it in terms of sort of the dominant tropes of the intolerant, the hypocritically intolerant liberal, and obviously I can't deny that I wanted it to resonate with that current, but it's not, you know. I never said that Barbara and Joe were narrow minded, or that they couldn't tolerate a foreign thought. It wasn't that either. It was more an ideology that was built into these academic habits, which were
Yes, a
themselves
tacit
ideological.
formation. What you encounter was a tacit formation that.
A tacit formation, yeah.
And then here's the next sentence. Nobody said his book or his paper, nobody said his paper on conservative cultural oppression was unacceptable. And next sentence. What happened instead was a series of conversations which the content of his work was never directly engaged, in which the objections took the form of scholarly advice about concreteness and insularity and relevance, in which the acceptable conclusion was communicated before the argument was examined, in which the coalition's judgment, meaning the ruling coalition at Stanford, was delivered through the accumulated texture of who invited whom to lunch and whose recommendation arrived promptly and whose door stayed open. So what was being enforced was tacit knowledge about what counts as legitimate scholarly work. Knowledge so deeply embedded in the shared formation of the Stanford Law faculty that its bearers did not need to articulate it and may not have been able to articulate it.
Yeah, I think, well, that is part of it, but I think yeah, it's in part sort of, yeah, a certain understanding of what scholarship is, which was never fully articulated, but it was also the status game. It was both those things together, and both of those things were tacit. So one was like a certain idea of what serious scholarship is, which could not be, which was actually quite narrow, and therefore couldn't be, and self-serving, and couldn't be articulated. but also, you think about, you sent me this thing about Stanford. I think they just displaced Yale as number one in
Mm-hmm.
the U.S. News rankings for law schools.
Mm-hmm.
And so the public pays a lot of attention to those rankings. Among academics, the US News has always been less important than, say, who is placing more academics in sort of the top positions.
Right.
So how many tenure track jobs is Yale, Harvard, Stanford, etc. landed? Where do they get these jobs? um Things like that. And so you also, in addition to the sense of the unarticulated tacit sense of what qualifies as scholarship, there's also just like knowing, like, the original plan was 1 year of research to get on the job market. And yeah, Stanford cares about it cared about, we've got to get people jobs and get them in like prestigious institutions, and their egos were like super tied to that as well. And even though now Stanford took number one in U.S. News, it's certainly a not as old a prestigious law school as Yale or Harvard. It's much newer, and it's always sort of had to deal with that. And so yeah, that's I you could say I fucked them from the point of view of where their egos were invested. You know,
Okay, let
uh,
me
their
let me jump
their
in.
hostility was overdetermined.
Yes, great. So the opposite of overdetermined perhaps is under-theorized. So, uh,
Yeah, well, there's many levels.
yes. Okay, let me
Uh,
add a little bit more here. So
okay.
what defeated you at Stanford Law was a specific form of ideological enforcement that is the hardest to contest and the hardest to even identify as enforcement. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so, and I think that is always it defeated me at Stanford, but prior to that defeat, it also wore me down elsewhere, just in philosophy, in
Yeah.
grad school at Indiana in Bloomington.
Tacit
Uh,
formation is kicking your ass, bro, and mine too.
yeah, I mean, I'm just I've been fighting it. Right now I'm kind of exhausted. That's why I'm
That's why you're
trying
talking to
to.
me. Like if you weren't depressed, you wouldn't be talking to me, like all my girlfriends have told me.
What's that?
All
If I
my
went to.
girlfriends have told me that they wouldn't be with me if they weren't depressed. So if you weren't beaten down, you wouldn't be taking the time to talk to me.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, no, I'm certainly beaten down. No, I mean, I can manage it, but I mean, you go over the, so much work, so little recognition. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure some people are more resilient than me, but yeah, no, it's been quite a beating. But I'm hoping I can get maybe this Heritage American article, get something out there and try to get. I just have to, you know, get to the point. I've got to reconnect with the dominant liberal culture on some level in order to promote my ideas.
Yep. So here's more
Okay.
from my new thoughts on your memoir. So when Guldmann's colleagues told him his work lacked concreteness, they were applying a criterion that they experienced as an intellectual judgment rather than as a coalition filter. So what we experience is often very different from what it is. So from
Right.
inside their tacit formation, work that took conservative complaints about cultural oppression seriously as a philosophical object, well, that just looked off, not well formed, not engaging the right questions in the right way. So their criterion of concreteness was not experienced by them as a pretext, cynically deployed to suppress heterodoxy. For them, it was the authentic expression of a trained perception that had been formed to find certain questions worth asking and other questions not worth asking. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I guess like by what they meant by concreteness was something that concrete for them meant placing the work within the inherited framework of what previous scholars had done. So, you have
John
these
Rawls. Yes.
it could be John Rawls, it could be various debates about the Establishment Clause and religious neutrality. But to be concrete was to position yourself as helping to address or resolve or illuminate um, some question which was already out there. And that's why, again, their intellectual commitments were always intertwined with, status preservation. Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, that's what they didn't realize. They had that. They had the, they we're not going to judge an idea in the in terms of free of status. They didn't have a raw conception of they did to an extent of which ideas should resonate with us and which shouldn't. It was ultimately a question of did it fit into this pre-existing social framework. They
Right.
knew people who were specialists in the Establishment Clause,
Right.
and it needed to resonate with
Nobody,
them.
yeah, nobody can experience ideas outside of their own tacit formation. And so
Right.
what they did is what we all do, and this is what tacit knowledge claims do in all
Yeah.
institutions. They naturalize coalition preferences as truth, as intellectual
Right.
standards, so
Right.
it's impossible to distinguish truth or scholarly judgment from motivated coalitional enforcement, because from inside the formation there is no distinction to make. And so you could not contest the judgments because they were never stated as judgments. You can't argue against the criterion of concreteness that is applied through implication, through tacit expression rather than specification. You can't appeal against a perception of insularity that is communicated through a tacit texture of social interaction rather than through any formal explicit evaluation process. And this is just how all institutions work, including Stanford Law School.
Yeah, and just to elaborate on that, I would say that in a sense, every dominant ideology is kind of a self fulfilling prophecy. In
Yes.
that there is a certain truth to it, but it creates the conditions under which it becomes true. So, for example, if you look at the critical race theory, they would say yeah, so white supremacy or white racism is predicated on these dominant ideas that blacks are socially dysfunctional or criminal or something like that. And that's a lie, but it's a lie which generates a set of reality insofar as that if you have a lot of people who have those attitudes, then blacks will not find themselves will find themselves under conditions under which they're more likely to adopt these counterproductive behaviors. So, the ideology creates its own truth. And you can say that for academia as well. That is to say that there was a lot of vagueness and uncertainty, non concreteness, indeterminacy in my work, for a long time, certainly until the very end of the fellowship. So it's not like what they were seeing was absolutely false. There was an actual empirical corroboration, but it was the product of their own ideology. They created that truth. Insofar as academia is structured in such a way that it's just much easier to just enter the pre-existing flow of academic discourse rather than let your imagination wander, that if you choose the latter, you are going to be impeded on all these levels. So there is a truth to what they're saying. It's not a lie, but it's a socially
And,
constructed truth.
all truths are socially constructed, except for, I guess, natural truths that are objective in the universe. But perhaps more importantly, it was what they experienced as true.
Right. It was what they
Okay.
experienced as true.
Yeah. Yeah.
and
I,
what they turned into the conditions under which I had to operate.
right. I have to run. So let's